We're talking today about 7 things men do with women that quietly kill attraction almost instantly, and I want to start this conversation in a calm, honest, and very human way. This isn't about blaming men or criticizing women. It's about understanding behavior, emotional dynamics, and the small patterns that create big consequences in relationships. Welcome back to the channel. If this topic makes you uncomfortable already, that's usually a sign it matters. Over the years, working closely with people in emotional distress, I've noticed something that surprises many men. Attraction rarely dies because of one big mistake. It fades because of repeated behaviors that feel harmless, even loving, on the surface. I've sat across from men who were confused, frustrated, and genuinely hurt. They would say things like, "I did everything right," or "I gave her my all." And yet, the connection was gone. Not because they were bad men, but because they didn't understand how attraction actually works in real life. Here's the controversial part most people don't like hearing. Good intentions don't protect you from unattractive behavior. Caring too much in the wrong way can be just as damaging as not caring at all. I've seen relationships where the man was kind, loyal, consistent, and emotionally available, yet the woman slowly pulled away. Not out of cruelty, but out of emotional suffocation, loss of polarity, or feeling unconsciously burdened. As a therapist, confidentiality matters deeply to me, so I'll never share names or private details, but I can share patterns. I've watched men unknowingly train women to lose interest by how they show up, how they react, how they communicate, and how they abandon themselves trying to keep someone else comfortable. These men weren't weak, they were uninformed. This video isn't here to shame you, it's here to wake you up, to help you see the behaviors that silently drain attraction before you even realize what's happening. Some of what you'll hear may challenge what you've been taught about love, effort, and being a good man. Stay with me anyway. By the end of this, you won't just understand what not to do. You'll understand why attraction responds the way it does, and how to move differently without becoming cold, bitter, or someone you're not. 1. Losing yourself to keep her comfortable. Losing yourself to keep a woman comfortable is one of the fastest, quietest ways attraction fades, and most men never see it happening while it's happening. I want to explain what this means in simple terms, because from the outside it often looks like love, patience, or maturity, but emotionally it lands very differently. My work, I've sat with men who slowly edited their personalities without realizing it. They stopped speaking honestly because they didn't want conflict. They changed routines, opinions, even values, just to keep the peace. One man once said to me, "I don't even know when I stopped saying what I actually think." That sentence stayed with me because attraction doesn't disappear when a man makes mistakes. It disappears when a man disappears. When you constantly prioritize her comfort over your authenticity, you send a subtle message. Your inner world is negotiable. At first, this feels safe to her. There's less tension, fewer disagreements, more predictability, but safety without presence becomes emotional flatness. Over time, she's no longer responding to a man with depth and direction, but to someone who mirrors her moods and manages her emotions. This isn't about being harsh or uncaring, it's about emotional grounding. A grounded man doesn't need to smooth every moment. He doesn't rush to fix every discomfort. He allows space for disagreement without panic. When men lose themselves, they often believe they are being loving, but what they're really doing is abandoning their own center, and attraction needs a center to orbit. I've watched relationships where the woman couldn't explain why she felt less drawn anymore. She would say things like, "He's great, but something feels off." What felt off was the absence of polarity. She couldn't feel where he stood because he was always standing where she needed him to stand. There was no emotional edge, no sense of direction, no self-respect being modeled. From a therapeutic perspective, this pattern often comes from fear. Fear of loss, fear of conflict, fear of not being enough. But when you live from fear, you teach the relationship to revolve around fear too. Comfort becomes the goal instead of connection. And connection requires honesty, tension, and selfhood. Attraction doesn't respond to perfection. It responds to presence. Presence comes from knowing who you are, even when it creates discomfort, especially then. The men who learn this don't become cold or distant. They become stable. They stop shrinking to fit and start standing as they are. If there's one thing I want you to take from this section, it's this. A woman doesn't fall out of attraction because you had boundaries. She falls out of attraction when you stopped being someone she could emotionally feel. 2. Over-explaining your feelings instead of living them. Over-explaining your feelings is one of those habits that sounds healthy, mature, and emotionally intelligent, yet it often does the opposite of what men hope it will do. When we talk about this, we're not talking about emotional openness being wrong. We're talking about the way emotions are delivered, repeated, and used in the relationship. There's a big difference between expressing yourself and narrating your inner world until it loses impact. In my experience working with men, I've noticed a pattern. Many of them learned that if something feels off, the solution is to talk more, explain more, clarify more. They believe that if a woman fully understands what they feel and why they feel it, closeness will automatically return. So they sit her down, walk her through every emotion, every thought, every insecurity, sometimes multiple times. What they don't realize is that attraction doesn't grow through emotional lectures. It grows through emotional embodiment. I remember speaking with a man who said, "I've told her how much she means to me in every possible way." He truly believed repetition would create reassurance. But what was happening underneath was that his feelings stopped feeling alive. They became words instead of energy. When emotions are constantly explained, they start sounding like justification rather than truth, and justification subtly signals uncertainty. From a therapeutic point of view, attraction responds more to how a man lives than to how well he explains himself. Confidence isn't declared, it's demonstrated. Calm isn't described, it's felt. When a man is emotionally grounded, he doesn't need to constantly process everything out loud. His actions, tone, and consistency communicate more than paragraphs ever could. Another issue with over-explaining is that it often comes from anxiety. The need to be understood immediately, completely, and without discomfort pushes men into over-verbalizing. They try to control the outcome of the conversation instead of allowing space for emotions to settle. But emotional pressure, even when wrapped in honesty, still feels like pressure. I've seen women pull back not because a man shared his feelings, but because he made his feelings her responsibility to manage. When every emotion is explained, dissected, and revisited, the relationship becomes heavy. There's no room for mystery, curiosity, or emotional movement. Everything is pinned down, labeled, and fixed in place. Healthy emotional expression is concise, honest, and grounded. It leaves room for silence. It trusts that the connection doesn't need constant verbal maintenance. Men who learn this don't shut down emotionally. They simply stop flooding the space. Attraction stays alive when emotions are felt, not endlessly discussed. When you live your feelings through your presence and actions, they land deeper, stronger, and more naturally than any explanation ever could. 3. Making her the center of your entire world. Making a woman the center of your entire world often begins with good intentions. It usually comes from love, excitement, and the desire to show commitment. But in real emotional dynamics, this behavior slowly drains attraction rather than strengthening it. I want to explain why in a grounded and practical way because this is one of the most common patterns I see in men who are confused about why things changed. In my work, I've met men who reorganize their entire lives around one relationship. Their schedules, priorities, goals, and even moods began to orbit one person. When I asked them what they enjoyed outside the relationship, many struggled to answer, not because they had nothing to offer, but because they had quietly placed their life on pause. Attraction doesn't thrive in a vacuum. It thrives in the presence of a full, moving life. When a man makes a woman his emotional sun, something subtle shifts. She stops feeling chosen and starts feeling responsible. Instead of sharing life with a grounded partner, she becomes the source of his happiness, direction, and emotional stability. That weight isn't romantic, it's exhausting. Even when she cares deeply, the dynamic creates pressure she didn't ask for. From a therapeutic lens, this often comes from a misunderstanding of devotion. Many men believe love means sacrifice without limits, but healthy attraction is built on balance, not self-erasure. A man with purpose, friendships, discipline, and personal direction brings energy into a relationship. A man who gives all of that up sends the message that his life only has meaning through her presence. I've heard women say things like, "I feel like I'm his whole life and it's too much." What they're responding to isn't attention, it's dependency. Attraction needs space to breathe. When everything revolves around one person, there's no contrast, no independence, no sense of two complete individuals choosing each other. Another issue is that when she becomes your entire world, you unconsciously start monitoring her reactions. Her mood dictates your mood. Her availability dictates your peace. Over time, this creates emotional imbalance. You're no longer showing up as a partner with stability. You're showing up as someone seeking regulation. Men who reclaim their center don't become distant or uncaring. They become anchored. They love from fullness, not from need. They invite a woman into their life instead of asking her to become their life. Attraction grows when a woman can feel that you stand on your own feet, not because you don't care, but because your identity doesn't collapse without her. When you are whole on your own, love becomes a choice, not a requirement, and that distinction changes everything. 4. Seeking constant reassurance and approval. Seeking constant reassurance and approval inside a relationship is one of the most misunderstood attraction killers because it often hides behind affection, vulnerability, and the desire to feel secure. I want to talk about this through the lens of someone who is already in a relationship, because this pattern usually doesn't show up on the first date. It shows up once emotional attachment has already formed. I once worked with a man who had been in a committed relationship for years. From the outside, everything looked stable, but privately, he admitted that he was always checking in emotionally. He needed to hear that things were okay, that she was happy, that she still cared. If she was quiet, distracted, or tired, his mind immediately went to self-doubt. He would ask questions like, "Are we good?" or "Did I do something wrong?" Not occasionally, but often enough that it became a rhythm in the relationship. What he didn't realize was that reassurance, when it becomes constant, slowly shifts the emotional balance. Instead of two partners sharing stability, one partner becomes the emotional anchor while the other keeps leaning. Over time, the woman begins to feel less like a partner and more like a regulator of his self-worth. From a therapeutic perspective, reassurance seeking isn't about love. It's about anxiety. It's the fear of losing connection, dressed up as communication. In small doses, reassurance is normal and healthy, but when a man needs repeated confirmation to feel okay, attraction starts to erode. Not because the woman is cruel or uncaring, but because confidence is no longer felt, only requested. In long-term relationships, this pattern often leads to emotional fatigue. The woman may still care deeply, but she begins to feel watched, measured, and responsible for his emotional state. If she has a bad day, she feels guilty. If she needs space, she feels questioned. Slowly, the relationship becomes less about shared joy and more about emotional maintenance. I've heard women in relationships say things like, "I feel like I'm always reassuring him and I don't even know why anymore." That sentence matters. Attraction fades when reassurance replaces presence, when confidence needs to be spoken instead of felt. Men who break this pattern don't stop communicating. They stop outsourcing their emotional security. They learn to self-regulate, to sit with uncertainty, to trust their value without constant confirmation. This doesn't make them distant. It makes them steady. In a relationship, steadiness is deeply attractive. It allows both people to relax. When you stop asking to be chosen over and over, you give space for her to choose you freely. And that shift changes the emotional climate of the entire relationship. 5. Ignoring boundaries in the name of love. Ignoring boundaries in the name of love is one of the most damaging patterns I see in long-term relationships, especially because it's almost never intentional. Most men who do this truly believe they're being supportive, available, and committed. But when boundaries are crossed repeatedly, attraction doesn't just fade. Trust and emotional safety begin to weaken. I once spoke with a man who had been in a relationship for several years. He described himself as always there, always checking in, always ready to help. If his partner wanted space, he stayed close. If she asked for time alone, he found ways to remain present. In his mind, love meant access. What he didn't realize was that he was slowly teaching her that her needs for space, autonomy, and emotional breathing room were negotiable. In a relationship, boundaries are not walls. Their structure. They allow two people to stay connected without losing themselves. When a man ignores boundaries, emotional, mental, or time-related, he sends a subtle message that his need to stay close matters more than her expressed limits. Even when this comes from affection, it creates emotional friction. From a therapeutic standpoint, boundaries are essential for attraction because they preserve polarity and respect. When a woman says she needs time to think, decompress, or simply exist on her own, and a man pushes past that, she begins to feel unseen. Over time, being unseen turns into being unsafe, not physically, but emotionally. And attraction cannot grow where safety is compromised. I've heard women in committed relationships say things like, "He means well, but I feel overwhelmed." That feeling doesn't come from love itself. It comes from love without restraint. When every boundary is questioned, softened, or overridden, the relationship starts to feel intrusive rather than intimate. Another issue is that ignoring boundaries often masks insecurity. The fear of distance gets confused with the fear of loss. So instead of honoring space, the man closes it. He checks in more, asks more questions, offers more presence than is needed. But closeness that isn't chosen freely doesn't feel good. It feels forced. Men who respect boundaries don't become distant or detached. They become trustworthy. They show that they can handle discomfort, separation, and uncertainty without panic. This creates relief, not distance. In healthy relationships, boundaries protect attraction. They allow desire to move naturally instead of being managed. When you honor her limits without resentment or pressure, you show emotional maturity. And maturity is one of the strongest foundations attraction can stand on. 6. Reacting emotionally instead of staying grounded. Reacting emotionally instead of staying grounded is a pattern that quietly reshapes the emotional tone of a relationship over time. It doesn't usually start with big arguments or dramatic moments. It starts with small reactions, tone shifts, defensive responses, emotional spirals that slowly change how safe and stable the relationship feels. I once worked with a man who was deeply committed to his relationship. He cared, he listened, and he wanted things to work. But whenever his partner expressed frustration, disappointment, or even mild criticism, he reacted immediately. He defended himself, explained his intentions, or became visibly affected. What he saw as engagement, she experienced as emotional instability. In relationships, emotional grounding matters more than emotional intensity. When a man reacts quickly, he hands over his center. His mood rises and falls based on her words, her tone, or her silence. Over time, this creates an imbalance. Instead of feeling supported by his steadiness, the woman begins to feel responsible for his emotional state. From a therapeutic perspective, this pattern often comes from unresolved sensitivity. The man isn't weak, he's unregulated. His nervous system interprets feedback as threat, so he reacts instead of responding. But attraction responds to regulation. It responds to a man who can pause, breathe, and choose his response rather than being pulled into every emotional wave. In long-term relationships, this becomes especially draining. A woman may start to withhold honest feedback, not because she's manipulative, but because she doesn't want to trigger a reaction. She learns that expressing herself leads to tension, explanations, or emotional fallout. When that happens, emotional intimacy begins to shrink. I've heard women in relationships say, "I feel like I have to be careful with my words." That sentence is important. Attraction fades when expression feels risky. Safety isn't just about kindness, it's about emotional containment. A grounded man doesn't suppress emotion. He processes it internally first. He listens fully before responding. He allows discomfort without needing to immediately fix it or defend against it. This creates emotional leadership. It tells the relationship, "I can handle this." Men who learn to stay grounded don't become distant or cold. They become calm. Their presence lowers tension instead of amplifying it. That calmness is deeply attractive because it creates trust. In a relationship, staying grounded doesn't mean being perfect. It means being stable enough that emotions can move through you without controlling you. When a woman feels that stability, she relaxes into the connection, and attraction has space to grow again. 7. Staying where you're no longer respected. Staying in a relationship where you are no longer respected is one of the most painful attraction killers because it doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly through tolerated behavior, unspoken resentment, and the quiet hope that things will change if you just try harder. Many men remain in these situations not because they are weak, but because they confuse endurance with love. I once spoke with a man who had been in a long-term relationship where the tone had shifted. Small dismissive comments became normal. His opinions were brushed aside. Jokes at his expense were framed as harmless. When I asked him when he last felt truly respected, he went silent. That silence said more than words ever could. In relationships, respect is the soil attraction grows in. Without it, desire can't survive. When a man stays despite repeated disrespect, he unknowingly teaches the relationship how to treat him, not through words, but through tolerance. Over time, the woman doesn't lose attraction because she's cruel. She loses attraction because the dynamic no longer contains strength, boundaries, or self-regard. From a therapeutic perspective, staying without respect often comes from fear. Fear of being alone, fear of starting over, fear that asserting boundaries will lead to loss. But what many men don't realize is that attraction rarely returns in an environment where self-respect is absent. Love doesn't restore respect. Self-respect does. In committed relationships, this pattern often looks subtle. The man becomes quieter. He avoids topics that might lead to dismissal. He laughs off comments that hurt. He tells himself it's not worth the fight. But every time he does this, he erodes his own presence. And when presence fades, attraction follows. I've heard women say in sessions, "I don't know why, but I just don't see him the same anymore." What changed wasn't love. It was the absence of grounded self-worth being expressed. Respect isn't demanded loudly, it's embodied consistently. Men who choose not to stay where they're disrespected don't do so out of anger or ego. They do it out of clarity. They address issues calmly. They set boundaries. And if those boundaries aren't honored, they're willing to step back. That willingness alone often shifts the dynamic. In a relationship, attraction is sustained when both people feel each other's self-respect. When you stop tolerating what diminishes you, you don't lose your value. You reveal it. And that, more than effort or sacrifice, is what keeps attraction alive. Attraction doesn't disappear because you're not good enough. It disappears when emotional balance, self-respect, and grounded presence are slowly lost. Throughout this video, you've seen that the fastest attraction killers aren't dramatic mistakes, but everyday behaviors men normalize without questioning them. When you stop abandoning yourself, stop overmanaging emotions, and start standing firmly in who you are, relationships change. Not because you become distant, but because you become stable. If this video challenged you, that's a good sign. Awareness is the first step toward healthier, stronger connections built on respect, presence, and emotional maturity.